Well, joining me now is Shane Johnson from African law firm Wentzel to talk a little bit about the role of employers regarding COVID-19. What are some of the health and safety obligations of the employer when it comes to this? Let me just speak to him now. Thank you very much for joining us, Shane. So basically, what are some of the obligations that employers need to be mindful of now that we have this coronavirus? And I suppose it really doesn't matter. They would need to have been mindful of the Occupational and Health and Safety Act anyway.
Yes, definitely. The Occupational Health and Safety Act definitely comes into play. There is an overarching obligation on employers in terms of that act to ensure that the workplace is not only safe for employees, but also healthy for employees. So given that the coronavirus has now landed on our shores, and as much as there might only be 7 cases, employers should be proactive in making sure that the workplace is also healthy for employees.
Yes.
They need to be proactive in that regard, I'd say.
So what is it that they need to be doing to be proactive?
So I think that it isn't, anything extraordinary than their normal obligations that they normally would have under the OHSA. They need to conduct a risk assessment, and our advice to some of the employers that we have been advising is that they should appoint a committee. Some employers have actually called it a COVID-19 committee. It's an internal committee in the workplace, comprised of individuals from relevant departments such as human resources, risk and compliance. And if the employer is a large employer, they should have a occupational medical practitioner.
Yes.
That person could also sit on that committee. And the whole purpose of that committee is really just to ensure that there's one stream of communication to employees about the virus and the employer's approach to the virus. Of course, it could be an employer with a multinational footprint with employees that travel, and there are all sorts of considerations, especially if employees travel for business to affected countries, for example. On the ground in the workplace, it may be necessary for employers to put in certain proactive measures, such as, for example, in my workplace, we have hand sanitizer machines across the building. Those are easily accessible. If the virus does start spreading, it may be necessary for the workplace to include an area or secluded area for people who may become symptomatic at work, and then maybe a testing environment as well.
Yes.
So it really just, I think the answer can develop as the virus spreads. Hopefully it doesn't.
So what is the approach for employers if in the hopefully unlikely circumstance that we do see more cases of coronavirus and an employer discovers that one of their employees or more have the disease or the virus? How should they approach that employee in terms of especially leave, in terms of sick leave?
Okay, so I think it's very important that employers are cautious with that kind of employee. They obviously also need to make sure that they don't violate our Employment Equity Act in how they treat those employees once they discover that they do have the virus. Of course, such an employee should not be allowed to remain in the workplace. They should be sent home and requested to see a medical practitioner. Once they have a medical note, it's really easy. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act applies, as well as the sick leave policy in that particular workplace. And so that employee will then be placed on sick leave, and they'll be required to take ordinary sick leave. The difficulty, though, comes in for employees who are asymptomatic and may have traveled to an affected country and may be required to be placed in quarantine. And the question that then arises there for employers is, what type of leave do you afford an employee who is asymptomatic and has traveled to an affected country? Our advice to employers is that if it is an employer precautionary measure, they've requested the employee to be placed in quarantine. In such an instance, we argue that it wouldn't necessarily be sick leave because there is no medical note, but we would argue that that employee would be placed in quarantine on some kind of special paid leave, though,
yes,
because it's the employer who's instructed that employee to be in quarantine.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think in your case, you know, being a white-collar employee, it would be easier for you to work from home in those circumstances. But what about your factory worker? I mean, we can't assume that a factory worker won't be affected by this.
100%. Those employees who are able to work from home and have the technology available at home, they would be able to be quarantined or isolated in their home or wherever they are required to be by the health authorities, and they can work, and in that instance they won't be on leave, so even sick leave wouldn't be applicable. Of course, if they are sick, they probably won't be able to work. But you correctly point out, if you are a worker in a factory, for example, or at a mine, we've advised clients in those industries as well, it becomes more difficult. And there the employer will unfortunately have to safeguard the rest of their workforce if there is a suspected case or someone who may have been exposed to the virus.
Yes. So just in conclusion, just your final points that perhaps we haven't touched on to employers who are keenly listening to this message.
Right, so I think that the key message is around setting up the committee, which I spoke about initially.
Yeah.
I think that's a crucial first step for all employers to ensure that communication to all employees is uniform, and also measures that are rolled out across the workplace are also sanctioned by the employer, sanctioned by management, and that also will avoid panic amongst the workforce. And just like we heard in Britain, the virus is spreading, but prevention is better than cure, and trying to react as opposed I think it's important to be proactive in this situation.
Thank you for your advice, Shane. That was Shane Johnson. He's from Wentzel.